The plot thickens around the recent mutiny in Russia as recent narratives start to fall apart. In a recent report from the Wall Street Journal, they say that Prigozhin and his Wagner forces plan to capture Russian Defense Minister Shoigu and the Chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov. Supposedly, the two were set up to visit an area near the border with Ukraine, at which point Wagner would roll up, detain the two, and then who knows? I mean, if their security details anything like the troops in and around Rostov, that probably could have been done pretty easily. That same report says that Prigozhin ditched the plan and decided to march to Moscow when his mutiny plot was uncovered by the FSB a few days prior to execution, which raises a lot of questions. I mean, for starters, my question is, what's the plan after Shoigu and Gerasimov are in custody? Fire off some demands of Putin and hope that despite all we know about the Russian leader, that this time would be different, and he'd give in to pressure and show that he's being forced into making a decision. Everything Prigozhin did here was risky. He essentially put it all on the line with no chances of walking it back. So I guess at the end of the day, holding military leadership hostage or marching to Moscow, it's probably all about the same. Now, if the FSB knew about this 2 days before it kicked off, it kind of seems like they kept that information to themselves. I mean, from the minute this thing started, it could have spiraled out of control at any point. You know, an armed mutiny isn't like a hockey fight where you let it play out for a bit and then the official waits for a good time to step in and break it up. Let's say an order was put out to Russian forces to not engage Wagner troops and hope to avoid escalation. First off, there's no evidence that that order was ever given, but for argument's sake here, we'll just say that it did. It's a bold move to assume that not one Wagner soldier will get trigger happy or just plain make a mistake, and now you've got a shooting war on your hands. There's another scenario here where the plot may have been uncovered, but those in the know decided to withhold that information, opting to see how the whole thing played out. Probably going to be a bad couple days or weeks for anybody in that camp, assuming that information flow is somehow uncovered. But it's not crazy that Prigozhin has at least some modest level of support at higher levels of the Russian government. He may not be reaching Putin's poll numbers, not by a long shot, but you don't get to run a small army in Russia financed to the tune of $1 billion over the last year without at least a few key influential backers. Now, as the mutiny was taking shape, a video was put out by General Surovikin asking Prigozhin to stand down. I heard somebody refer to this as a coerced video, and it did look a little bit odd. You know, part of that might be that it was supposedly filmed in the middle of the night, but it does kind of have like a hostage video feel to it. Surovikin is the general that was placed in charge after Ukrainian forces took Kharkiv last fall, and it was under his guidance that the defensive positions all along the front were built and reinforced. Eventually, he was moved out of that role and into the position of overseeing the air forces across the Ukraine theater of operations. For all the hatred that he's directed towards the Russian Ministry of Defense, Prigozhin seemed to like Surovikin, but unlike Prigozhin, Surovikin does not do a lot of interviews or put out random rants on social media, so it's not clear exactly if that feeling is mutual. Then as all eyes were on Prigozhin as to whether or not he'd be arrested or just have an unfortunate accident, news came out that Surovikin may have known about this mutiny days before it kicked off. This was reported by the New York Times, and honestly, it kind of makes me wonder if there's legit intelligence behind this assessment or if it's just the United States using this as an opportunity. I mean, this whole situation is kind of teed up perfectly for the United States to randomly leak that anyone they don't like maybe was involved. I'm not saying the entire report was made up, just why not throw it out there? I mean, worst case, these guys get some extra FSB scrutiny. Best case, Putin is overly cautious right now and locks them away. Of course, I have no idea if Surovikin was actually involved in this or not, but whether it was that U.S. statement or other evidence they had on hand, it appears he was locked up sometime on Wednesday the 28th. Straight out of the Moscow Times with the headline, Russian general arrested following Wagner mutiny. The article goes on to say they got this from two sources close to the defense ministry who spoke on the condition of anonymity. They stated, quote, apparently Surovikin chose Prigozhin's side during the uprising and they've got him by the balls, end quote. Not an enviable position. However, this whole mutiny uprising deal is still pretty recent, and there's been a lot of rumors circulating as of late. So we'll have to wait and see where this all sits in the next few days and weeks. You know how when a speech by a president gets all hyped up, like something major is about to happen, and you wait for it and people speculate on what it could be, but then it happens, and it's like nothing was said at all. Just vanilla talking points that couldn't be any more boring. If you're ready for that kind of letdown, then Russian President Putin really came through in a few speeches just after the Wagner mutiny. I mean, an armed force storming across the country, shooting down Russian aircraft, and at the very least, insinuating leadership changes were about to happen at gunpoint. I don't know. I just thought we might get a little more than this. So So on June 26th, Putin addressed the nation in a 4-minute speech. Not a lot there, but this little snippet stood out to me. Quote, "An armed mutiny would have been suppressed in any event. Mutiny plotters, despite the loss of adequacy, were bound to realize that. They understood everything, including the fact that their actions were criminal in nature, aimed at polarizing people and weakening the country, which is currently countering an enormous external threat and unprecedented pressure from the outside. They did this at a time when our comrades are dying on the front line with the words, 'not a step back,'" end quote. I like that "would have been suppressed in any event" comment from Putin there. I mean, probably, big picture, at least it would have been messy, but it's interesting that he's so quick to essentially write it off as, don't worry, totally had it under control. Then the next day, he spoke to a gathering of police, military, and government leaders where he presented awards to those who he says helped stop the uprising. During that event, he gave a few more interesting clips saying, quote, "Your resolve and courage, along with the consolidation of Russian society, played an essential and decisive role in bringing the situation back to normal. Those who were drawn into the mutiny saw that the army and the people were not with them. The swift and well-managed deployment of defense, security, and law enforcement units helped prevent the situation in the country from going down a very dangerous road and ensure that there were no civilian casualties," end quote. All right, couple items there. First, I'm not sure we saw that the army and the people were not necessarily with Wagner. I don't mean to suggest the entire military and the entire population were cheering on Prigozhin, but at the very least, what we saw in and around Rostov, the city they occupied in southern Russia, the support certainly seemed to be there. At least with the civilians who were cheering him on and taking pictures. With the military, it looked a little more like indifference. I mean, Prigozhin and Wagner marched right into the Southern Military District headquarters unopposed, heavily armed, and took over the entire place along with a few airports. I wouldn't take that to mean that all Russian forces in and around Rostov support Prigozhin, but that's a far cry from, as Putin put it, swift deployment of defense, security, and law enforcement. This was the military leadership, and far from stopping Prigozhin and putting this thing down, they just sort of stepped aside. It's that sort of contradiction that makes this whole thing seem just far from over. I mean, Putin and Russian leadership were pretty quick to identify Prigozhin and some of the Wagner fighters as the major issue here, but they've got their hands full, not just dealing with those who committed the mutiny, but figuring out who lent passive support just by letting them continue. Something I'm very interested in is understanding overall Russian support for the war in Ukraine. And fortunately, we've got a new poll here that dives right into that, asking some pretty contentious questions. I know there are regularly those clips of Russian TV circulating social media with some pretty wild takes, but in fairness, those are debate-style shows where everyone is kind of designed to start yelling at one another. I'm not sure that is the perfect representation of the broader Russian public. All right, before diving into some of these numbers, which were collected from June 16th to June 19th, normal qualifiers that no polls are perfect. And in this case, I would assume there are quite a few respondents that didn't answer at all. Part of me wants to think that those who provided no feedback were more likely to kind of push back on the official state narrative, which is why they didn't want their voice to be heard. But I don't know. There could also be plenty of people fully behind everything Putin does, and they just don't really want to be out there with a public opinion. Either way, we've only got numbers from the people who answered, so that's what we're going to look at. Starting with the big one, 57% view the war is going well for Russia, which is up 2% from the same poll done in February. Only 46% trust official accounts of how the war is going, and this number was even lower with respondents who said they get most of their news from Telegram or other internet platforms. 55% said they're tired of hearing about the war, and this tends to track right alongside level of income. So the more money a respondent made, the more likely they were to be tired of hearing about the war, which is probably attributable to who's doing the majority of the fighting, which tends to be lower economic classes all across the country, which makes sense. They wouldn't be tired of hearing about the war. Many of them have loved ones who have died or currently fighting or could be considered for future mobilizations. This one I thought was pretty interesting. They asked if respondents had heard about the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. If they answered yes, the next question was, who do you think is responsible? 44% said Ukraine, 6% said Russia. Makes sense. But 10% said the United States and 3% said Europe. Now, I've seen a lot of narratives floating around since that whole event went down, but I can't say I've seen much about the United States or any nation in Europe being the ones responsible for the dam's destruction. As for future operations, 64% would support a new attack on Kyiv, and 72% would support Putin's signing of a peace agreement tomorrow. Of note, that support for attacking Kyiv is at its highest level since this poll began about a year ago. Now, those two questions kind of seem contradictory, right? 64% wants another attack on the Ukrainian capital. 72% says they're open to a peace agreement. I think it's because the two questions were asked separately. We've got one later where it kind of asks, what do you think Russia should do next? Across demographics, the poll was pretty well split on whether to continue the war or seek negotiations. 45% want to keep fighting, and 44% said that talks are in order. Now, if a second official wave of mobilization was needed, that changes a little bit. In that case, it's 54 to 35 in favor of negotiations. When asked about what Russia needs to do next, 39% said that Russia needs to go back on the offensive, 30% said dig in and hold what you got, and 12% said the right move is to withdraw troops from Ukraine. I'm interested in how you all interpret those numbers. Are those generally in line with what you thought or skewed in one direction or the other? Let's transition out of Ukraine briefly. It's easy to get exclusively focused on what's happening there, and that is understandable. I mean, it's the largest land war in Europe since World War II, and the possibility of it leading to World War III is ever present. It's a good reason to keep an eye on events in that region, but there still are quite a few other national security topics going on all around the world. China may be ready to reopen ties with the U.S. military, but they've got terms. The reestablishment of this direct hotline between the two was a point brought up during Secretary Blinken's recent visit, but is pretty quickly shot down. This type of military-to-military hotline is critical in de-escalating situations that could spiral out of control as each side kind of dreams up worst-case scenarios and lacks the ability to just hop on a quick call with their counterpart and sort things out. In a recent statement, China said that the reason for their severing of this critical point of contact is due to U.S. sanctions. If those sanctions are removed, they say, cooperation between the two militaries can continue. This comes alongside reports recently that China is supposedly negotiating with Cuba to place some sort of military installation on the island. It's not immediately clear what the location will be used for, but U.S. lawmakers have thrown out everything up to and including equipment to spy on the United States or even offensive missiles that could easily strike anywhere across the continental U.S. So an adversary placing missiles in Cuba. Seems like we've done this before. Don't take that as my saying there's any validity to the missiles going to Cuba claim. Still doesn't seem like it's clear what would be there, and it technically could be as minimal as Chinese troops offering to train and equip local Cuban forces. On the other hand, Commander Richardson of U.S. Southern Command, talking about Chinese activities in Latin America, recently stated that, quote, the PRC is spreading malign influence, wielding its economic might and conducting gray zone activity to expand its military and political access and influence, end quote. One of the concerns raised is that a Chinese military presence this close to the U.S. could disrupt our ability to respond in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. According to Evan Ellis, a Latin American expert at the U.S. Army War College, China could use the proximity of Cuba to deploy special operations personnel, disrupt the U.S. military, and attack the U.S. mainland to snap key supply chains supporting U.S. defense if Beijing were to attack Taiwan. But that's all I've got for now. Be sure to check out the national security sit-reps I put out on Substack. Link is in the description if interested. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.